Cole's presence had a weight to it, a kind of physical gravity that pulled the air out of a room and reshaped it around him. For 6 months, I had orbited this man, a silent moon to his unblinking sun, learning the cartography of his moods through the subtle shift of his shoulders or the tightening of his jaw. He was my foreman, the steady hand on the rudder of our chaotic construction sites, and I was just another carpenter on his crew, one of a dozen sawdust-covered men who took his orders, admired his skill, and kept a respectful distance. For them, it was respect. For me, it was a carefully constructed wall to hide the fact that I couldn't breathe properly whenever he got too close. My life had settled into a quiet rhythm of loneliness. Work, home, sleep, repeat. My small apartment was a testament to a life lived on the periphery, neat, impersonal, a holding pattern for a future I couldn't quite envision. I had friends, but our conversations felt like skimming the surface of a deep, dark lake. I never talked about the things that mattered, the ache in my chest that had become a dull, constant companion. It was easier to be the quiet one, the good listener, the one who faded into the background. At work, I was Leo, the guy who was good with detailed finish work, the one who never caused trouble. Dependable, invisible. And I watched Cole. I watched the way his calloused hands could be both powerful enough to frame a house and gentle enough to coax a warped piece of hardwood into place. I watched the way the sun caught the flecks of gold in his brown hair when he took off his hard hat to wipe the sweat from his brow. I memorized the sound of his voice, a low baritone that could cut through the scream of a circular saw without ever rising to a yell. It was a foolish, pointless fascination, a secret garden I tended in the barren landscape of my own life. He was my boss. He was, as far as anyone knew, completely straight. And I was an expert at wanting things I could never have. Then came the cabin project. It was a monster, an architect's fever dream perched on the edge of a mountain 3 hours from the city. All glass and cedar and sharp, aggressive angles, with a cantilevered deck that seemed to float over a sheer drop. It was a high-profile, high-stress job. When the client's budget got tight, cuts had to be made. That meant a skeleton crew for the final, most complex phase, the deck and the interior finishing. Cole gathered the crew on a Monday morning, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The blueprints were spread across the hood of his truck, held down with rocks and a thermos of coffee. He was all business, his gaze sweeping over us. "All right," he said, his voice carrying easily in the morning quiet. "The next 4 weeks are going to be tight. I can only take one guy up to the mountain house to get this thing done on time. It's on-site living. Long days." A murmur went through the crew. Living on-site meant isolation, bad food, and a break from whatever lives they had back in the city. For most, it was a drawback. For me, my heart gave a painful, stupid lurch. Cole's eyes scanned the group, and for a fleeting second, they landed on me. I held his gaze for a fraction of a second longer than was normal, a tiny, reckless rebellion. I saw something flicker in his expression, not recognition, exactly, but a moment of stillness, of assessment. Then he looked away. "I need someone who's meticulous," he continued, his finger tracing one of the complex joinery details on the blueprint. "Someone who can handle the fine work without me having to look over their shoulder every 5 minutes." My stomach twisted. That was me. That was my specialty. I was the guy they called when the trim had to be perfect, when the tolerances were non-existent. It was the one area where I didn't feel invisible. He looked up again, and this time his eyes found mine and stayed there. The background noise of the city, the idle chatter of the other men, it all just faded away into a low hum. There was only the space between us, charged with a question I was too terrified to even hope for. "Leo," he said. My name. Just my name, but the way he said it, it sounded like a decision. "You're with me." And just like that, the quiet, predictable orbit I had maintained for 6 months shattered. I was being pulled into the sun. I wasn't sure if I would be illuminated or if I would just burn up. The drive up the mountain was mostly silent. Cole handled his truck with the same effortless competence he applied to everything, navigating the winding dirt roads without a word. I sat in the passenger seat, hyper-aware of the space between us. The cab was filled with his scent, a mix of sawdust, coffee, and something clean and masculine, like soap or fresh laundry. It was a scent I'd caught in passing on job sites, but here, in this enclosed space, it was overwhelming. It seeped into my clothes, into my lungs. I felt like I was drowning in it. I stared out the window at the blur of pine and aspen, my own reflection a ghostly presence against the scenery. What was I doing? 2 weeks, a month maybe, in a tiny cabin with the one person who could unravel me with a single glance. It was a special kind of masochism, a self-inflicted torture I had somehow stumbled into. My internal sarcasm kicked in, a familiar defense mechanism. Congratulations, Leo. You've won the grand prize, an extended stay at Camp Hopeless Crush. The cabin we were meant to stay in was small, as promised. One main room with a kitchenette and a pot-bellied stove, a tiny bathroom, and a cramped loft with 2 mattresses on the floor. It was rustic and smelled of pine needles and wood smoke. It was also intimate, dangerously intimate. There would be no escaping each other here. We would hear each other breathe at night. We would bump into each other making coffee in the morning. Cole dropped his duffel bag on the floor with a heavy thud. He surveyed the room, his expression unreadable as always. I watched him, my own bag suddenly feeling heavy in my hand. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen 100 times, but that felt different here, more personal. Well, he said, his voice a low rumble in the small space. It's not the Hilton, it's fine, I managed to say, my own voice sounding thin. He turned to me, and that steady gaze of his pinned me to the spot. It was a look that always made me feel like he could see straight through the carefully constructed walls I'd built around myself, right down to the frantic, yearning thing that lived inside me. You take the bed by the window, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a quiet command, an assignment of space. He was already organizing our temporary world, creating order out of the potential chaos of our proximity. He was the foreman, even here. That first night, I lay on my mattress, listening to the sound of the wind in the pines and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the man sleeping less than 10 feet away from me. Sleep felt like a distant country I had no visa for. Every rustle of his blankets, every sigh he made in his sleep, was a thunderclap in the silence. I was acutely aware of his body, a warm, solid presence in the darkness. My own body felt like a live wire, humming with a nervous energy that had nowhere to go. This was my life for the foreseeable future, a quiet, sustained state of panic. The first few days settled into a routine. We were up before the sun, the mountain air sharp and cold in our lungs. We'd move through the small cabin in a practiced, careful dance, avoiding contact as we made coffee and packed a lunch. Then we'd walk the short distance to the construction site, where the half-finished house stood like a skeletal silhouette against the dawn sky. And I watched him work. It was different than on a crowded city job site. Here, there were no distractions. It was just the two of us, the sound of our tools, and the vast, indifferent wilderness around us. I watched the fluid economy of his movements, the way he never wasted a step or a motion. He could drive a nail in 2 precise strikes, make a complex cut with a single pass of the saw. There was a grace to his strength that was mesmerizing. He was a patient teacher when he needed to be. He'd explain the complex physics of the cantilevered deck, his voice calm and steady, his finger tracing lines on the blueprints. He'd stand close, his shoulders sometimes brushing mine, and the scent of him, that mix of sawdust and clean sweat, would fill my senses. I would focus on his words, on the technical details, trying desperately to ignore the low-level hum that started in my veins every time he was near. My internal monologue was a relentless, exhausting commentator. He's just standing close because the blueprints are small. He's just being a good boss. Don't read into it. But my body betrayed me. A simple brush of his hand against mine as we passed a chalk line felt like an electric shock. I'd pull back too quickly, a jerky, awkward movement that I was sure he noticed. He never said anything, but sometimes I'd catch him looking at me, his head tilted slightly, a thoughtful, questioning look in his eyes. One afternoon, I was struggling to position a heavy joist hanger, my fingers fumbling with the screws. I was tired, my focus slipping. Here, his voice came from right behind me. I hadn't even heard him approach. Before I could react, his body was flush against my back, his chest a solid wall of warmth. He reached around me, his arm caging me in. His hand, large and calloused, covered mine, guiding it. "You're fighting it," he said, his voice a low murmur near my ear. His breath was warm against my skin. Let the tool do the work, my own breath hitched. I could feel the steady beat of his heart against my shoulder blades. My mind went completely blank. All I could feel was him, the strength in his arm, the heat of his body, the faint scrape of his stubble against my temple as he leaned in closer to see the angle. He guided my hand, setting the screw, and for a few seconds, we were moving as one. It was the most intimate contact I had ever had with another person, and we were fully clothed, holding a power drill. Then, just as quickly, he stepped back. The cold mountain air rushed into the space he'd vacated, and I felt suddenly, strangely bereft. Like that, he said, his voice back to its normal, professional tone. He clapped me on the shoulder, a friendly, masculine gesture that felt like a deliberate re-establishment of boundaries. Take a break. Drink some water. He walked away, leaving me standing there, my heart hammering against my ribs. I touched my ear where his voice had been, my skin still tingling. I analyzed the moment, turning it over and over in my mind like a strange jewel. Was it just a foreman helping his worker? A simple, practical instruction? Or was it something more? My mind, the cautious, cynical part of me, insisted on the former. But my body, my traitorous, hopeful body, hummed with the memory of his closeness, convinced of the latter. The evenings were the hardest. After 10 hours of hard labor, we'd return to the small cabin, our bodies aching. We'd take turns in the tiny shower, a necessary intimacy that felt fraught with tension. I would stand under the weak stream of hot water, trying not to think about the fact that he had been in this same small space just minutes before, that the steam still carried his scent. We ate our simple dinners mostly in silence, sitting at the small wooden table. The silence wasn't hostile, but it was heavy. It was filled with all the things we weren't saying. I would watch him across the table, the way the lantern light carved shadows onto his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the weariness in his eyes. I wanted to ask him things. Not about work, but about him. Where did he grow up? What did he think about when he was staring out at the mountains? Did he ever get lonely? But the questions always died on my lips. I was the quiet one, the invisible one. I didn't know how to cross that line. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of hoisting beams, we were sitting on the cabin's small porch, nursing beers. The sun had set, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple, littered with a spray of stars you could never see in the city. A comfortable silence had settled between us, punctuated by the chirping of crickets. My old man was a carpenter, Cole said suddenly, his voice quiet. It startled me. He rarely volunteered personal information. Built houses all over the state. Dragged me along to job sites since I was old enough to hold a hammer. I turned to look at him. His profile was silhouetted against the fading light. He was staring out at the dark line of the mountains. Did you always want to do this? I asked, my own voice softer than usual. He took a long swallow of his beer before answering. No, I wanted to be a pilot. See the world from above. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Life has other plans, I guess. My dad got sick. I had to take over the business. He fell silent for a moment, and I could feel the weight of an old story, a life path diverted. But I don't regret it, he added, his voice low. There's an honesty to it, to building something real with your own hands. Something that will stand long after you're gone. He turned his head and looked at me, and in the dim light, his gaze was less foreman to worker and more man to man. It was open, unguarded, vulnerable. What about you, Leo? He asked. What do you actually want? The question hit me with the force of a physical blow. No one ever asked me that. They asked me how a project was going, or if I could work on Saturday. No one asked what I wanted. The truth rose in my throat, a hot, bitter pill. I want to not be so alone. I want someone to look at me the way I look at you. I want you. I couldn't say any of that. So I did what I always did. I deflected. I shrugged. I don't know, I said, looking down at my hands. I'm good at this. It pays the bills. The silence that followed was different. It felt like a missed opportunity, a door that had opened a crack and that I had gently pushed shut. I could feel his gaze on me, steady and assessing. I risked a glance up and saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Disappointment, maybe. Or perhaps I was just projecting my own feelings onto him. He nodded slowly, then turned back to the mountains. Yeah, he said quietly. It does that. We finished our beers in silence, but the air between us had changed. He had shown me a small piece of himself, and I had hidden mine away. The careful distance I had tried to maintain felt less like a protective wall and more like a prison of my own making. The storm rolled in on a Tuesday, without warning. One moment the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the next it was the color of a fresh bruise. The wind came first, a low moan through the pines that quickly escalated into a violent howl. It tore at the tarps covering our lumber, sending sawdust and debris swirling through the air. "Get everything secured," Cole yelled over the wind, his voice a commanding roar that cut through the chaos. Now, we moved with frantic, desperate energy. Rain began to fall, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. It soaked us to the skin in seconds. We wrestled with tarps that billowed like angry sails, using our combined weight to hold them down while we secured them with scraps of lumber. The temperature plummeted. My hands, numb with cold, struggled to grip the tools. A brilliant fork of lightning split the sky, followed an instant later by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very mountain beneath our feet. Inside, Cole grabbed my arm, his grip like iron, and pulled me toward the skeletal structure of the house. We stumbled into the relative shelter of the main room, rain pouring through the unfinished roof, and stood there, gasping for breath, water streaming from our clothes. The world outside was a maelstrom of wind and water. The lights in our small cabin flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the valley into a deeper darkness. "Power's out," Cole stated the obvious, his voice tight. He was looking out at the storm, his jaw set, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He wasn't scared, but he was alert, every line of his body radiating a tense energy, like a predator assessing a threat. "We should check on the cabin," I said, my teeth chattering. "Not in this," he said, shaking his head. "Too dangerous. We waited out here, so we waited." We huddled together in the driest corner we could find, the sound of the storm a deafening roar around us. The cold began to seep into my bones, a deep, persistent chill that my soaked clothes did nothing to ward off. I was shivering, my body shaking uncontrollably. Cole noticed. Of course, he did. He noticed everything. Without a word, he moved closer. He put an arm around my shoulders, pulling me against his side. The heat from his body was a shock, a startling, welcome wave of warmth that seemed to sink right through my wet shirt. "Here," he said, his voice a low rumble against my ear. Block the wind. It was a practical gesture, a logical solution to a problem. My foreman was making sure his employee didn't get hypothermia. That's what my brain told me. But my body, pressed against the solid, warm wall of his torso, told a different story. I leaned into him, my shivering slowly subsiding as his body heat transferred to mine. His arm was heavy and solid around my shoulders. I could feel the hard muscle of his bicep against my back. I rested my head against his shoulder, a move of pure, instinctual need for comfort and warmth, and he didn't pull away. He just tightened his grip slightly, a silent, reassuring pressure. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, not speaking, just listening to the storm rage. In the chaotic darkness, with the wind howling like a wounded animal, the normal rules didn't seem to apply. The carefully maintained distance between us had been erased by a shared crisis. Huddled together against the storm, we weren't foreman and worker. We were just two men, seeking warmth and shelter from the fury of the elements. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. I felt anchored. I felt safe. The storm eventually blew itself out, leaving behind a world washed clean and silent. The rain softened to a gentle patter and then stopped altogether. The moon broke through the clouds, bathing the wet landscape in a pale, silvery light. Cole's arm was still around me. Neither of us had moved. The urgency of the situation had passed, but the contact remained. The silence now was different from the pre-storm silence. It was softer, more fragile. I was intensely aware of the side of my body pressed against his, the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. I should move. I should thank him and pull away, re-establish the boundary. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed by the simple, profound comfort of his touch. He shifted slightly, and I thought he was going to pull away. My body tensed in anticipation of the loss. But he didn't. He just adjusted his position, settling more comfortably against the wall, his arm remaining firmly in place. He let out a long, slow breath. "You ever feel small?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper in the vast quiet. I turned my head to look at him, but in the darkness, I could only see the outline of his face. "What do you mean?" "Like this," he said, gesturing with his free hand to the storm-ravaged world outside. The mountain, the sky, all of it. Makes you realize how insignificant all the other stuff is. The deadlines, the budgets, the noise. He paused. All the things you think are so important, they're just static. It was the most introspective thing I had ever heard him say. The man who was always in control, always focused on the tangible, the practical, was talking about feelings of insignificance. It was another crack in the stoic facade, another glimpse of the man underneath. All the time, I answered honestly, my voice just as quiet. I feel like I'm just static most of the time. He was silent for a long moment. His thumb began to move, a slow, almost absent-minded stroking motion on my shoulder. Each small movement sent a tiny jolt of electricity through my system. It was such a small gesture, but it felt incredibly intimate. It felt like a response, an acknowledgement. "You're not static, Leo," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "You're the quietest guy on the crew, but when you're working, you're loud. The work speaks for you. It's precise. It's careful. It's good." My throat tightened. He saw me. He actually saw me. Not just as a pair of hands, but as a person, as a craftsman. The praise, coming from him, in this place, in this moment, meant more than any compliment I had ever received. It was a pinprick of light in the vast darkness of my own self-doubt. "Thanks," I whispered, the word feeling ridiculously inadequate. We finally made our way back to the dark cabin, our boots squelching in the mud. The air inside was cold and damp. Cole found a lantern and a box of matches, and soon a warm, golden light filled the small room, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. We stripped off our wet clothes in a shared, functional silence, turning away from each other to grant a small illusion of privacy in the one-room space. I pulled on a dry t-shirt and sweats, my skin still tingling from the cold, or maybe from something else. Cole lit the pot-bellied stove, and soon the crackle of a fire joined the gentle sound of dripping water from the eaves outside. We sat at the table, wrapped in blankets, sharing a flask of whiskey he had tucked in his bag. The liquor was a fiery trail down my throat, chasing away the last of the chill and loosening something tight in my chest. In the flickering firelight, the unreadable mask was gone from his face. He just looked tired, and something else, something softer. He caught me looking at him and held my gaze. The silence stretched, but it wasn't awkward. It was a weighted, knowing silence. The storm had washed away the pretense, leaving something raw and real in its place. I felt a reckless bravery bubble up inside me, fueled by the whiskey and the strange intimacy of the night. "Why me?" I asked, the question coming out before I could stop it. He raised an eyebrow. "Why you for what?" "For this job," I clarified, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "You could have picked anyone. Mark is faster than me. Dave has more experience with framing." He leaned back in his chair, swirling the whiskey in his metal cup. He watched the liquid for a moment before looking back at me. His eyes were dark and serious in the lantern light. "Mark is fast, but he's sloppy," he said, his voice low and even. "Dave is experienced, but he doesn't see the details. He sees a house. You." He paused, searching for the words. "You see a home. You see the way the light will hit a piece of trim in the morning. You see the grain of the wood. I needed someone who sees." He took a drink of whiskey, his eyes never leaving mine. "And," he added, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a rough, intimate timbre that vibrated through the small space between us. "I needed someone I could stand to be in a small room with for a month without wanting to put a hammer through the wall." He gave a small, wry smile. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't just about my work. It was about me. My quietness, my steadiness. The very things that made me feel invisible were the things he had chosen. The air grew thick with unspoken possibilities. The small cabin, which had felt so dangerously intimate before, now felt like the only place in the world. Just us. The fire crackling. The low light. My heart picked up its pace. This is it. This is the moment. My mind is screaming at me to say something, to do something, to close the small distance between us. But I am a creature of habit, and my oldest habit is fear. I looked down into my cup, breaking the contact. "Oh," I said quietly. "Well, good." The moment passed. The fragile, shimmering bubble of possibility popped, leaving only the familiar, heavy silence in its wake. Cole drained his cup, the sound of the metal hitting the wooden table unnaturally loud. "We should get some sleep," he said, his voice once again shaded with a professional distance. Long day tomorrow, as I lay in my bed in the loft, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady breathing of the man below, I was consumed by a tidal wave of self-loathing. He had opened the door again, and I had stood on the threshold, too afraid to walk through. "You see a home," he'd said, and all I could see was the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of finally finding my own. The next morning, the tension was back, thicker than before. It was a physical presence in the small cabin, a third person at our breakfast table. We moved around each other with a new, stilted awkwardness. The easy camaraderie of the storm, the shared vulnerability of the night, it had all evaporated with the morning light, leaving a residue of unresolved questions. At the work site, the air was just as charged. We worked with a fierce, focused intensity, using the hard physical labor as an outlet for the things we couldn't say. We communicated in clipped, professional tones. "Level, hand me the impact driver. Check that measurement." The space between us hummed with an almost painful energy. Every time we brushed past each other, every time our eyes met over a piece of lumber, it was like a spark jumping a gap. We were working on the main support beam for the cantilevered deck. It was a massive piece of engineered lumber, heavy and unwieldy. It had to be set into its steel saddle with absolute precision. A fraction of an inch off, and the entire structural integrity of the deck would be compromised. We had been struggling with it for over an hour, wrestling it into position, only to find it was slightly off-kilter. Cole was getting frustrated. I could see it in the tight line of his shoulders, the way he was breathing through his nose. He ran a hand over his face, smearing a streak of dirt across his cheek. "Damn it," he muttered, glaring at the spirit level, its bubble mocking us from just off-center. "It's not sitting right. Maybe if we try lifting from my end," I started to suggest, but he cut me off. "No, it's not about strength," he said, his voice sharp with impatience. He stepped back, his eyes scanning the beam, the saddle, me. He was analyzing the problem, his foreman's brain dissecting the mechanics of our failure. Then his eyes locked on me. "You're thinking too much, Leo. You're trying to force it. You need to feel it." I didn't know what that meant. Feel the beam. It was an inanimate object. But before I could ask, he was moving toward me. He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides, his expression intense, determined. He was a force of nature, and I was standing directly in his path. He didn't say another word. He just acted. He took my hands off the beam, and then, before I could process what was happening, he put his hands on my hips. His grip was firm, possessive. It wasn't a casual touch. It was a statement. My entire body went rigid. A jolt, hot and sharp, shot through me, from the points of contact on my hips all the way down to my toes. He adjusted my stance, moving me a few inches to the left, setting my feet wider apart. He pressed me back until my shoulders were flush against the rough wood of the support pillar behind me. I was effectively pinned between the pillar and his body. He leaned in close, his face just inches from mine. I could see the flecks of sawdust in his eyelashes, the faint scar above his right eyebrow. I could smell the scent of his skin, warm and male and real. "Stand here with me," he growled, his voice a low, vibrating thing that seemed to resonate in my own chest. "Stop thinking. Just feel the balance. Feel where the weight needs to go." My mind was a riot of panic and exhilaration. This was not professional. This was not about leverage or physics. His hands were still on my hips, his thumbs pressing into the hollows just above my hip bones. His body was a shield in front of me, blocking out the rest of the world. It was just us, the beam, and the charged, electric space between our bodies. I could feel the heat of him through my jeans. I could feel the tension humming in his muscles. I did as he said. I stopped thinking. I closed my eyes for a second and just felt. I felt the solid pillar at my back, the unyielding strength of his hands on my hips, the subtle shift of my own weight. I breathed in, and my chest brushed against his. His breath hitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible sound, but in the ringing silence between us, it was a confession. "Now," he whispered, his voice rough. Together, he didn't let go of me. He kept one hand firmly on my hip, anchoring me, while the other reached out to the beam. I mirrored his movement, my own hand finding its place beside his. Our fingers brushed. He adjusted his grip, lacing his fingers through mine. Our hands, clasped together on the beam. It was a gesture of such shocking intimacy that it stole the breath from my lungs. "On three," he murmured, his eyes locked on mine. Just a slight shift. To the left. Feel it. I could barely nod. I wasn't feeling the beam. I was feeling the rough callus on his palm against mine, the strength in his grip, the way his thumb was stroking the back of my hand. 1, 2, 3. We moved as one, a single, fluid motion. The beam shifted, a deep groan of wood and steel, and then settled perfectly into its saddle with a solid, satisfying thud. It was perfect. The bubble on the level sat dead center. But neither of us moved. We stayed right where we were, pinned against the pillar, his hand still on my hip, our fingers still laced together on the beam. The job was done, the problem solved, but the moment wasn't over. It was stretching, thinning, becoming something else entirely. He slowly, deliberately, released my hand, but his other hand remained on my hip. He leaned his forehead against mine, his eyes closing. His breath was warm and smelled faintly of coffee. "See," he whispered, the word a puff of air against my lips. "We work well together." In sync, the subtext was a deafening roar. He wasn't talking about carpentry anymore. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, so loud I was sure he could hear it, feel it. This was the moment. The door wasn't just open. He was standing in the doorway, holding it for me. All I had to do was walk through. I am frozen. My body is a live wire, humming with a terror and a hope so fierce they feel like the same emotion. My mouth is dry. I can't find the words. So I do the only thing I can think of. I lift my free hand, the one he just released, and I slowly, hesitantly, bring it to his face. My fingers tremble as I brush the streak of dirt from his cheek. His eyes flutter open. They are dark, endless pools, and they are filled with a question. My fingers linger on his skin, on the rough stubble of his jaw. It's the first time I have ever touched him by choice. It is a terrifying, liberating act. It is my answer. A muscle in his jaw clenched under my fingertips. He let out a shaky breath, and the hand on my hip tightened, pulling me even closer, until there was no space left between us at all. The world seemed to narrow to this single point, this single man. Nothing else mattered. The half-built house, the mountains, the sky, it was all just static. The only thing that was real was the solid warmth of him, the desperate hope in his eyes, and the unspoken promise hanging in the air between us. The walk back to the cabin that evening was a study in silence. But it was a new kind of silence. Not the awkward, questioning silence of the morning, but a heavy, simmering silence, pregnant with anticipation. We walked side by side, the rhythm of our steps in sync, our arms occasionally brushing against each other. Each accidental contact was a fresh jolt, a reminder of the line we had crossed, of the new language we were speaking with our bodies instead of our words. We ate dinner. I don't remember what it was. I moved on autopilot, my senses dialed up to an unbearable degree. I was aware of every move he made, every glance, every breath. The air in the cabin was so thick with unresolved tension it felt hard to breathe. The fire in the stove crackled, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. We were orbiting each other in the small space, caught in a gravitational pull that was getting stronger by the second. After we finished eating, I stood at the small sink, my back to him, washing the dishes. My hands were shaking. I could feel his eyes on me. I could feel his presence behind me, a palpable weight in the room. He hadn't moved from the table. He was just sitting there, watching me, waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. The waiting, the not knowing, the simmering hope that was threatening to boil over and scald me. I turned off the water, dried my hands on a towel, and turned around to face him. He was still sitting there, his hands resting on the table, his expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light. "I can't do this," I blurted out, the words raw and clumsy. My voice sounded foreign in the quiet. He didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, patient. "Can't do what, Leo?" he asked, his voice a low, calm rumble. My carefully constructed walls were crumbling. The fear I had lived with for so long was being replaced by something else, something more powerful. The terror of letting this moment slip away. "This," I said, my voice cracking. I gestured vaguely at the space between us, at the whole impossible situation. "I can't pretend this is just a job for me. I can't. I can't stand next to you and pretend I don't feel." I trailed off, the words failing me. My throat was tight, my eyes were burning. He stood up slowly, the legs of his chair scraping against the wooden floor. He didn't take his eyes off me. He started walking toward me, each step deliberate, measured. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He stopped directly in front of me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He was so much bigger than me, a solid, immovable mountain of a man. He lifted a hand, and I flinched, expecting. I don't know what I was expecting. Rejection. A placating pat on the shoulder. But his touch was impossibly gentle. He tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear, his rough fingers surprisingly soft against my skin. His thumb brushed against my cheek, a slow, deliberate caress. His gaze was intense, searching, as if he was trying to read the last 10 years of my life in my eyes. Then he said 2 words that shattered the last of my defenses. I know he knew. He had known all along. My secret, the one I had guarded so carefully, the one I thought made me invisible, had been seen. And he hadn't run. He had walked toward me. He leaned in, and the world tilted on its axis. His other hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my skin. He was giving me time to pull away, to stop him. I didn't. I couldn't. I leaned into his touch, a silent surrender. And then he kissed me. It wasn't a frantic, desperate kiss. It wasn't rushed or hungry. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was honest. His lips were firm and warm, and they tasted faintly of whiskey and coffee. It was a kiss of profound reassurance, a quiet confirmation of everything that had been simmering between us for weeks. It was a kiss that said, I see you. I know you. And I'm here. I melted against him, my hands coming up to grip his shirt, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning universe. He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me tight against his chest, and the kiss deepened. It was a conversation without words, a story of loneliness and longing finally finding its resolution. It felt like coming home after a long, weary journey. It felt like I could finally breathe. We didn't talk much after that. There was nothing left to say. Words felt clumsy and inadequate compared to the language we were now speaking. He led me to the ladder to the loft, his hand warm and firm in mine. We climbed into the small space, and in the pale moonlight filtering through the window, we found our way to one of the mattresses. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, just a slow, mutual exploration. His hands were everywhere, in my hair, on my back, tracing the line of my spine. They were the hands of a builder, calloused and strong, but his touch was reverent, almost gentle, as if he were handling something precious and fragile. I explored him in turn, the hard planes of his chest, the corded muscle in his arms, the surprising softness of the skin at the nape of his neck. It was a tangle of limbs and blankets, of soft breaths and quiet sighs. It was the simple, profound intimacy of being held, of being wanted. He pulled the blankets over us, cocooning us in warmth and darkness. He settled onto his back, pulling me with him, so that my head was resting on his chest. I could hear the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath my ear, a rhythm that was both calming and exhilarating. His arm was a heavy, comforting weight around me, his hand resting in the small of my back, holding me securely against him. I lay there, listening to his breathing deepen as he drifted toward sleep, and I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost painful. The constant, low-grade anxiety that had been my companion for as long as I could remember was gone. The loneliness that had carved out a hollow space inside me was filled. In the quiet darkness of the mountain cabin, wrapped in the arms of my foreman, I felt whole. I drifted off to sleep, not to the sound of the wind or the crickets, but to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. I woke to the gray light of dawn filtering through the small loft window. For a moment, I was disoriented, unsure of where I was. Then it all came flooding back. The storm, the confession, the kiss, the quiet intimacy of the night. A jolt of panic, cold and sharp, went through me. I was in Cole's bed. Or my bed. Our bed. I turned my head. The space beside me was empty. The blankets were thrown back. He was gone. The peace I had felt just hours before evaporated, replaced by a familiar, sickening dread. It was a mistake. A one-time thing. An aberration brought on by isolation and whiskey and a storm. He woke up this morning, realized what he'd done, and couldn't get away from me fast enough. The narrative of my life, the one where I was always found wanting, came roaring back. I sat up, my body aching in a pleasant, unfamiliar way. The cabin below was silent. I swung my legs over the side of the loft and climbed down the ladder, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor. The fire in the stove had been rekindled, and a pot of coffee was percolating on top, filling the small room with its rich, dark scent. And then I saw him. He was standing on the porch, his back to me, a mug of coffee in his hand. He was just staring out at the mountains, which were shrouded in a low-hanging mist. He was dressed, ready for work. The foreman, my boss. My stomach twisted itself into a tight, painful knot. This was it. The morning after conversation. The part where he would let me down gently, tell me it was a mistake, that we should just forget it ever happened and get back to work. I braced myself for the impact. I poured myself a mug of coffee, my hands trembling slightly, and pushed open the door to the porch. It creaked, announcing my presence. He didn't turn around right away. He just stood there for a long moment, his shoulders set in a way I couldn't quite decipher. Finally, he turned his head and looked at me. His face was unreadable, the familiar mask of the stoic Foreman back in place. There was no softness there, none of the vulnerability from the night before. Just a quiet, impenetrable stillness. "Morning," he said, his voice neutral. "Morning," I replied, my own voice barely a whisper. I stood awkwardly by the door, clutching my coffee mug like a lifeline. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. We were back to being strangers, two men who worked together, with the ghost of an impossible night hanging between us. The awkwardness was 1,000 times worse than the silence had ever been before. We went to the site. We started our work. We didn't talk. We moved around each other with a new, painful precision, our bodies careful not to touch. The easy rhythm we had found was gone, replaced by a stilted, conscious effort. Every time I had to hand him a tool, I would place it on the workbench between us rather than putting it directly into his hand. He did the same. The joy I had started to find in the work, in the creation of something beautiful and lasting, had curdled into a miserable chore. I felt his eyes on me as I worked, but when I glanced up, he would be looking away, his focus entirely on the task at hand. The internal monologue was back with a vengeance, a cruel, mocking voice. "See, you fool. You thought you could have this. You thought you were different. But you're just Leo, the quiet guy. The mistake." By mid-afternoon, I was a wreck. My hands were clumsy, my focus shot. I measured a piece of cedar siding, marked it, and made the cut. As the piece fell away, I knew instantly that it was wrong. I had measured from the wrong end. It was a stupid, rookie mistake, born of distraction and a heart that felt like it was breaking. I had wasted a $30 piece of specialty lumber. Damn it, I swore under my breath, throwing the ruined piece to the ground in frustration. Cole was beside me in an instant. He picked up the piece, looked at it, then looked at the measurement on the wall. He didn't say anything. He didn't yell. He didn't get angry. He just looked at me, and his expression was no longer unreadable. It was full of a deep, weary concern. He put down the ruined siding and the tape measure. Then, in the middle of the work site, under the bright, unforgiving light of the afternoon sun, he reached out and took my hand. His grip was firm, grounding. His thumb found my racing pulse at my wrist. He just held my hand for a moment, his eyes searching mine. The noise in my head, the screaming voice of my own insecurity, quieted. All I could feel was the warm, solid pressure of his hand around mine. "Last night," he said, his voice low and rough, "meant only for me. Was not a mistake." He said it so simply, with such quiet conviction, that it bypassed all of my defenses and went straight to the heart of me. Relief washed over me in a wave so powerful it made my knees weak. It wasn't a mistake. He wasn't regretting it. He was just quiet. He was just Cole. "I'm not good at this," he continued, his gaze dropping to our joined hands. "The talking part. I don't have the words for it, Leo. I never have." He looked back up at me, and his eyes were raw with a sincerity that took my breath away. "But that doesn't mean it's not real." He squeezed my hand once, a firm, reassuring pressure. "Measure it again," he said, his voice back to its normal Foreman's tone, but the edge was gone. "We'll get it right this time." He let go of my hand, and the loss of contact was a physical ache. But it was an ache tempered with a bright, soaring hope. He turned and walked back to his own task, leaving me standing there with my useless piece of wood and a heart that felt like it might just beat its way out of my chest. It wasn't a mistake. It was real. and we would get it right. The last week of the project passed in a dream. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, humming intimacy. We were still us. I was still quiet. He was still reserved, but everything was different. The silence was no longer heavy or awkward. It was comfortable, companionable. It was the silence of two people who understood each other without needing to speak. The small touches returned, but now they were no longer ambiguous. They were deliberate. His hand would rest on the small of my back as I passed him in a narrow hallway. He would brush a speck of sawdust from my cheek with a lingering thumb. I would hand him a tool, and our fingers would intertwine for a moment longer than necessary. Each touch was a quiet confirmation, a reaffirmation of the truth between us. The nights were ours. We would fall into bed, tired and sore from the day's labor, and find solace in each other's arms. We learned the rhythms of each other's bodies, the landscape of skin and bone and muscle. It was a slow, tender discovery, a mapping of new territory. It was more than just physical. It was a deep, soulful connection that seemed to knit together the frayed edges of my own loneliness. In his arms, I felt found. But as the house neared completion, a new anxiety began to creep in. Our time on the mountain was coming to an end. This cabin, this job, this bubble of impossible reality we had created for ourselves, had a deadline. Soon, we would have to pack up our tools and our lives and go back. Back to the city. Back to the main crew. Back to the real world where foremen weren't supposed to fall for their carpenters. What were we outside of this place? I was his subordinate. He was my boss. The power dynamic was a complicated, messy thing that we had managed to ignore up here, but it would be waiting for us down in the valley. The thought of seeing him on a crowded job site, of having to pretend that nothing had changed, of going back to being invisible, was a cold knot of dread in my stomach. On the last day, we did a final walkthrough of the house. It was finished. The cedar siding gleamed in the afternoon sun. The massive windows reflected the endless sky, and the deck hung over the valley, a perfect fusion of engineering and art. It was beautiful. We had built it. Together. We packed our tools in silence. The familiar sounds of metal clinking against metal, a somber soundtrack to our last few hours. The job was done. It was time to go home. Except, I didn't feel like I was going home. I felt like I was leaving it. We loaded the last of the equipment into Cole's truck. He closed the tailgate with a final, definitive thud. He turned to me, his hands in his pockets, and for the first time in days, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The real world was here, knocking on our door. He pulled a hand from his pocket. In his palm was a single, simple key. The key to the small cabin we had called home for the past month. The owner said we could hold on to it, he said, his voice quiet. In case we need to come back for any touch-ups. He looked from the key to me, his gaze steady and serious. The project's done, Leo, he said. But I'm not ready to leave, my breath caught in my throat. He took a step closer and held the key out to me. It lay there in his calloused palm, a small, brass promise. Stay, he said, his voice a low, rough plea. With me. For the weekend. We can figure it out from here. He wasn't offering me a solution. He wasn't offering me a promise of an easy, uncomplicated future. He was offering me a choice. A beginning. A chance to figure it out together. It was more than I had ever dared to hope for. I looked at the key, then back at his face, at the vulnerability in his eyes that he was trying so hard to hide. I reached out and didn't take the key. Instead, I closed his fingers around it and held his hand in both of mine. Okay, I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. It was hope. It was terror. It was love. Okay, Cole, a slow smile spread across his face. It was a real smile, not the wry, fleeting one I had seen before. This one reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and transforming his entire face. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. That evening, we didn't go back to the city. We went back to the little cabin. The job was over, the pressure was off. We weren't foreman and worker anymore. We were just Leo and Cole. We sat on the porch, a couple of beers sweating on the railing between us, and watched the sun go down. The sky bled from orange to pink to a deep, velvety purple. It was the same view we had looked at for a month, but it felt entirely new. Cole's arm was around my shoulders, his hand resting on my arm, his thumb stroking my skin in a slow, comforting rhythm. I leaned my head against his shoulder, the way I had during the storm, but this time there was no crisis, no fear. Just a deep, quiet contentment. I thought about the man I was a month ago, the one who had gotten into this truck, convinced he was heading toward a special kind of lonely torture. That man felt like a stranger to me now. He had been so sure of his own invisibility, so certain that his life was meant to be lived on the sidelines. He had built his walls so high and so thick that he couldn't see that the one person he wanted was quietly handing him the tools to tear them down. Cole had seen me. Not the quiet, dependable worker, but the man underneath. He had seen my careful work and understood my careful heart. He hadn't tried to force his way in. He had just stood beside me, solid and steady, and waited. He had made a space for me, and then he had growled, "Stand here with me." An invitation disguised as a command. An invitation to stop watching life and start participating in it. He shifted beside me, his arm tightening around me, pulling me closer into his warmth. "You're quiet again," he murmured, his lips brushing against my hair. I turned my head, my face nestled in the curve of his neck. I breathed in his scent, sawdust and soap in him. It was the scent of safety, the scent of home. "Just thinking," I said. "Don't think too much," he whispered, his voice a low, happy rumble. He pressed a soft kiss to my temple, and for the first time, I obeyed. I didn't think about the city, or the crew, or what would happen on Monday. I didn't analyze, or overthink, or worry. I just closed my eyes and felt. I felt the solid strength of the man beside me, the cool mountain air on my skin, and the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against my cheek. I wasn't just standing with him. I was building a life with him, and it was good. It was real, and it was just the beginning.